October 1929 downturn was only the beginning of the market collapse. By mid-November, the stock market had lost a third of its September value, and by 1932, when the market hit bottom, stocks had lost 90% of their value. A share of U.S. Steel, which had sold for $262 before the crash, sold in 1932 for $22. The stock market crash signaled the beginning of the Great Depression, but it was only one factor among many root causes of the Depression. A weak banking system, further collapse in already low farm prices, and industrial overproduction each contributed to the economic downturn. The disastrous 1930 Hawley-Smoot tariff, which raised average tariffs rates to nearly 60%, caused America's international trading partners to retaliate by raising rates on U.S. goods. The result was shrinking international trade and a further decline in global economies. As the effects of the Depression cascaded across the U.S. economy, millions of people lost their jobs. By 1930, there were 4.3 million unemployed. By 31, 8 million. And in 1932, the number had risen to 12 million. By early 1933, almost 13 million were out of work, and the unemployment rate stood at an astonishing 25%. Those who managed to retain their jobs often took pay cuts of a third or more. Out-of-work Americans filled long bread lines, begged for food, or sold apples on street corners. A Chicago social worker wrote that we saw want and despair walking the streets, and our friends, sensible, thrifty families reduced to poverty. More than a third of the nation's banks failed in the 3 years following 1929. Long lines of desperate and despairing people outside banks hoping to retrieve their savings were common. Many ordinary citizens lost their life savings when banks failed.
Henry Martinez says the winters were so cold, they huddled around a potbelly stove. Martinez's parents had 13 children, and they lived hand-to-mouth in a flat with shared bathrooms. You wanted to take a bath. You heat up the water in these big cans, Martinez says. It was always a challenge to keep warm. We hugged each other on the floor. We had little beds that open and close. When I think about it, it was horrible. It was horrible. And then the sanitation of the community. Garbage was just put out in the alley. And did that create a condition? Yes, it did. Tuberculosis. I know my sister came down with TB. Sometimes I like to block that out and just say, thank God you're here. He thanks God, but his Catholic Church didn't do much to help his family back then. At 76, Martinez works as a community organizer trying to help his old neighborhood, which is still poor. Robert Boyer, 84, of Lima, recalled the Great Depression story that his father was laid off from his railroad job shortly after the stock market crashed. His father, who looked for work 2 or 3 times per week, took odd jobs picking fruit or shucking corn. We had no auto, so walking was the only way to go, he wrote. Food and clothing were not the only hardships, he recalled. In the winter, his family huddled around the potbelly stove trying to keep warm. Fuel was hard to afford, Mr. Boyer wrote. But on the brighter side, our family survived.
In the South, sharecroppers, both white and black, endured crushing poverty and almost unimaginable degradation. African Americans suffered significantly higher levels of unemployment than whites due to pervasive racism. The financial crisis was not limited to the United States. Countries in Europe and around the world experienced a depression. Hitler's rise to power in Germany was fueled in part by the economic slowdown, and throughout the 1930s, international tensions increased as the global economy declined. President Hoover initially met the economic downturn from the perspective of his long-held principles. That is, his belief in minimal government interference in the economy, as well as conviction that direct public relief to individuals would weaken individual character, turn people away from the work ethic, and lead them to develop a dependency on government handouts. By 1931, Hoover reversed his earlier approach and embraced government intervention in the economy.
to all.
He said winter was a real hard time. He said more than a few times he made money by picking up cow chips. Especially the poor would pay you what little money they could for cow chips. Depression made money with selling cow chips for firewood.
For many, however, these actions were too little too late. Shanty towns of makeshift hovels, disparagingly called Hoovervilles, in disgust with the president's inaction on the face of the crisis, grew up across the country in public parks and in vacant lots, and out of work, unable to pay mortgages or rent, were evicted from their homes. Trouser pockets pulled out to signal the lack of money within them were Hoover flags. Newspapers used for warmth by the homeless were Hoover blankets. In November 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president in a landslide, winning 57.4% of the vote to Hoover's 39.7%. His 1932 run for presidency, Roosevelt asserted that he would help the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid and pledged himself to a New Deal for the American people. In his first inaugural address, saying, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," he sought to reassure the public amid the anxieties of the Great Depression. As president, he championed the series of federal legislative initiatives known as the New Deal. The New Deal was not a blueprint for action, but was instead animated by a spirit, as Roosevelt said, of bold, persistent experimentation, in which he would take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. On March 1933, Roosevelt delivered the first of his live fireside chats. In the first chat, he spoke about the banking crisis and explained the actions he and Congress had taken to address it. During his presidency, he delivered 30 fireside chats, explaining to the public in reassuring tones and plain-spoken language his New Deal policies and the Second World War through the medium of radio. Although the New Deal did not ultimately succeed in lifting the United States out of the Great Depression, the United States mobilization for World War II revived the economy during the late 30s and 40s.
Well, stories of the Great Depression would not be complete for me unless I told the story of my family. And I'll do that quickly. On the left, you see a picture of my dad, Louis, and in the middle, a picture of his store from the 50s, Make a Deal with Losing Louis. Yes, this channel is a tribute to him. But going back to the turn of the century, the early 1900s, the story of my dad, he was, I believe, the second to youngest of a family of 8 siblings. My grandfather, Ferruccio, came over from the old country with his wife, and they had kids, but his wife died at a pretty young age, I believe in childbirth, leaving my grandfather with quite a few children to take care of, and no way to do so. So what my grandfather had to do was put all of his children, all 8 of them, in an orphanage. So this was my father's reality when he was growing up. He lived in an orphanage with his siblings, and his eldest brother actually escaped the orphanage at 16 and went on the road. And the younger children were raised there by the Christian church. Paula Dietrich of Ashton, Toledo recalled the financial woes continued well into the 1940s for some families. What I remember as a child that might help others today is that nothing was wasted. Most things were reusable, and life took more effort. Until the 1990s, my mother saved soap slivers, she wrote. Shortages were many, but simple pleasures were plentiful. Sledding, skating, swimming, picnics, family reunions. Families read together in the evenings or listened to the radio. Children played with simple toys that only needed imagination, Ms. Ashton wrote. The air was clean, the food fresh and wholesome, the work hard, and the freedom wonderful.